Okay, so at this time, we'd like to move on to the next part of the meeting, um, which is a discussion of the missing middle. And here to talk about it, we have Peter Rusolo, who's from Arlingtonians for Our Sustainable Future. And then we also have Matt DiFerrante, who's a member of the Arlington County Board that will speak on it as well. So Peter has put together a presentation, and I'll ask him to go through that first. Peter?
Thank you very much, John, and thank you also to Lion Village Citizens Association for giving me this opportunity to present tonight. I'm a
Hey, Peter, before you talk, I forgot one thing here. I just want to say that Peter has a connection to Lion Village. He's a former resident, lived here for a number of years up on Key Boulevard near Herndon Street. He's also a member of the executive committee for a number of years, so he knows the neighborhood well. So when we heard this topic, we figured no better person to talk about it than Peter, who's knows the neighborhood and follows so many of these issues so closely. So anyway, thanks for coming, Peter.
Well, I appreciate that very much. As John said, I lived in the neighborhood for 14 years from 1997 to 2011 and got to know many friends there, some of whom are on this call. It's been a really wonderful opportunity for us to speak with you tonight. A little bit of background for those of you who don't know me. I have been involved in civic life in Arlington almost all the time I've lived here. I've spent 4 years as chair of the Arlington County Democratic Committee. I was also chair of the Fiscal Affairs Advisory Commission to the Arlington County Board, a co-chair of the Council on Instruction to the School Board. I'm currently writing a bi-monthly column on arlnow.com. And I'm involved in a number of other civic activities. We're here tonight to talk about the missing middle, and I think it's important for you to understand how the missing middle initiative of the county fits into its overall development agenda and what we would submit to be its accelerated development agenda over the course of the last several years, particularly in the context of the arrival of Amazon. And the development agenda is impacted quite a bit by Arlington's population forecasts, as discussed in the next slide. Just prior to the time that Amazon reached its decision to locate its headquarters here in Arlington, and based on information supplied by the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, the Arlington County government projected that our population here in Arlington would grow from about 238,000 in the year 2020, our current year, all the way up to over 300,000 in 2045. And the important thing to note about this is that these projections of population growth were based on existing zoning, land use plans, sector plans, and other land use decisions that were in effect in the year 2018. So none of this anticipated growth in population assumed anything like the missing middle initiative or upzoning or major other site plan developments that had not yet been disclosed to the county board or significant other upzoning that might occur outside the missing middle context. And this is a tremendous amount of population growth. And its importance is indicated with respect to its fiscal impact, as noted in our next slide. Just at the time, right before Amazon's decision, or at the time of Amazon's decision, Professor Fuller at GMU, Stephen Fuller, who was a preeminent regional economist in this area, did a calculation of what the impact would be of various activities that Amazon might engage in when it arrived here and organized its headquarters. And one of the things that he did was to calculate the average cost per resident of each new resident that would move to the county from that point forward. And he did that very careful calculation and concluded that each new resident coming to Arlington would require a net negative cost or a subsidy of over $850 per resident. And this has a significant impact on development and population growth before the missing middle is taken into account, but certainly also with respect to the missing middle itself. And it also takes place in the context of what our group, Arlingtonians for Our Sustainable Future, regards as, from time to time, excessive deference by county board members to the wishes of large developers, but not necessarily sufficient emphasis on what community members would like to see, as reflected in the next slide, which is a shareholders report that was prepared in connection with the merger of two major Arlington developers, Vornado and JBG Smith. And at the time, the merger was touted as something that was going to double the size of JBG Smith, and that JBG Smith anticipated major profits to be gained by its development of large multifamily housing developments in Arlington, just the kinds of developments that have significant net negative impacts on our budget with respect to APS, infrastructure, and other activities. And this leads us now to come to the missing middle initiative, which we discuss in the next slide. The missing middle idea has actually been around longer than its latest incarnation in October 2020. This was an idea that was has been surfaced in other cities for several years, was beginning to be surfaced in Arlington in late 2018 when Amazon made its decision, and was something that was planned initially at the beginning of 2019, when all of a sudden the advent of COVID cut down and delayed the schedule for the rollout of the missing middle. But nevertheless, the county Housing Arlington staff has now come forward with a revised version of the missing middle, which we find in several respects to contain serious design flaws. One of those flaws is that all of the sponsors of the missing middle housing initiative from county staff and the county board are committed to the idea that there's going to be a substantial amount of changes in zoning, elimination of single family zoning, and upzoning, regardless of how the missing middle study unfolds. In other words, they've decided that there's going to be significant upzoning, increased density, on top of the density that's leading to other potentially undesirable environmental and fiscal impacts, regardless of the outcome of the study. And we don't think that's a good idea. And we don't think that, we believe that the option of no change should have been at least an option that should have been studied, particularly in light of COVID-19 and its impact on rents and the housing market generally, as we'll discuss later. We've got an 8.6 rental vacancy rate in Arlington. There is no dire housing shortage. And the original idea, one of the main original ideas of missing middle in 2018 and the beginning of 2019 was the allure of the idea that if only we could have all of this additional missing middle housing, there would be significant reductions in housing costs and we would create more affordable housing. And actually, in the latest incarnation, missing middle housing, the Missing Middle Housing Initiative has abandoned explicitly this idea that we're going to create this additional affordable housing, and instead now is focused on creating housing for its own sake They even have adopted some of the language of the civil rights movement, talking about housing types that are underrepresented as if they were people instead of buildings. And they've done calculations over the summer that show that outside of metro corridors, there already are lots of missing middle housing types all over Arlington, although not necessarily in every single small neighborhood. So in fact, what we see missing middle is leading to is the raising of relatively affordable garden apartments throughout Arlington, and substituting in their place more expensive duplexes and triplexes that are not going to be affordable in the sense that the average person understands that term. So we'd prefer that we have a much more objective study which held out as a possibility that there would be no upzoning at all. And we're going to get to some more reasons for that in the next slide. One of the significant problems with upzoning from a legal perspective is basically upzoning is forever. If we change a neighborhood if we change the zoning in a neighborhood that is currently single family only zoned, and we try it out and we discover after 2 or 3 years that the impact on street parking, on big, taller buildings, on loss of the green space of a footprint, on flooding and everything else, and it's not working out, we can't just say to ourselves, well, this experiment didn't work out, so let's go back to the way it was, because under the law in Virginia, which is a strict property rights state, Arlington would expose itself to lawsuits by owners and developers that would likely be successful, and therefore, it's only a one-way street. It's only more density. And that really isn't going to work very well for us. And there are other reasons for that as well, as reflected in the next slide. It's probably sensible that the Housing Arlington folks who are sponsoring the current version of the missing middle study did abandon, or at least most of the time, they seem to have abandoned the idea that they're going to be creating relatively affordable housing, because that's simply not true in a hot market like Arlington. It hasn't been true for the 20 years or more, 23 years that I've lived here. Arlington added roughly 2,900 new units of housing per year, every year from 2000 to 2019, and prices kept going up. And the idea that we're going to create these relatively affordable duplexes is belied by the example that we have here of a Dinwiddie Street property that was originally a single family home that was on the market for, I think, something like $1.6 million. And it's been replaced by 2 duplexes, each of which are on the market for $1.1 million. And there are actually some activists in the community who have said, well, actually, Peter, these are relatively more, 1.1 million actually is more affordable than 1.6 million. And literally, mathematically, that I suppose that's true, but this isn't what the ordinary citizen, the ordinary resident thinks of as affordable housing. This is housing at the very high end of the income spectrum. It's not going to be something that's going to help people. It's going to drive out people on fixed incomes who won't be able to keep up with their tax bills. And it's going to squeeze out affordable housing. And we've seen that most recently in a sort of a fiasco on Columbia Pike, where there was a proposal to eliminate the cap on eligibility for affordable housing on Columbia Pike and take it up from 80% to 100% or potentially more. And the large groups of residents all along the Pike and the citizens associations and civic associations there opposed this, because they properly recognized what its impact was going to be, namely to create a lot of more new expensive housing, but to do nothing for affordable housing. And that leads us to look at for a little bit some of the negative impacts of these kinds of projects. The kinds of population growth that were anticipated by Arlington in that earlier slide, based on the information from the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, basically envisions increasing Arlington's population by an amount that's equivalent to the populations of the entire city of Charlottesville, for example. And that requires, as we saw with the $850 per resident number that Professor Fuller calculated, a really significant additional cost for new services, and APS is an example. There are a large number of our schools, as you know now, that use trailers to house classrooms. The Arlington Arlington Public Schools plan, so-called ASF plan for capital improvements over the next decade, has been hampered by the lack of siting for new seats for new students. We've seen discord over boundary reassignments this year in this cycle, and last year with respect to the moves of Key to ATS and McKinley, and the missing middle upzoning initiative, on top of what we'll discuss in the next slide, the failure of the county to have sites for schools in the out years, is a really serious problem. In this slide, we have a memo that County Manager Mark Schwartz sent to the Arlington Public Schools in November 2019, in which he hinted or implied that there were a number of sites throughout Arlington that they could consider for potential school seats in the out years. And some of these sites are sites that now are parkland. Some of them are sites of community centers. But at the root of it, the real problem with this whole situation is that there's no comprehensive public facilities master plan to site community centers, new fire stations, new schools, and other kinds of infrastructure in the out years. And as a result, some of these properties or adjacent properties that could have been folded into them are being gobbled up by the private marketplace. And we are a very land constrained county, and it is really a bad thing that we don't have a long-term public facilities master plan over 5 years after it was recommended that we have one by the Community Facilities Study Group. The county board has not made this a priority. It's 5 years later. They haven't pushed it. They haven't prioritized it. And that has an impact on making boundary processes in the county for schools a needlessly burdensome exercise compared to what it would have been if we had that kind of a plan. And I'm going to move now in the next slide to some of the environmental impacts and infrastructure impacts. Here is a slide recording an enormous break in a water main that you may recall occurred near Chain Bridge at the end of 2019, about a year ago. The impact was so severe that Arlington Public Schools had to shut down countywide for an entire day because of the threat of contamination of our water system. And this is simply symbolic of what the impact is on our aging infrastructure, our freshwater mains with the population we have today, let alone the population anticipated without any upzoning, and let alone what would be added to it with upzoning. So it's indicative of a problem, as are some of the other environmental impacts summarized in the next slide. Flooding. Flooding is severe. We've had 2 serious, really severe floods in Arlington in July 2019 and July 2018. Many of you either yourselves or have neighbors who were impacted by this flooding. We're really fortunate that no one died as a result of it, at least in Arlington. And our flooding infrastructure, as those of you who've been active with CivFed know, needs a tremendous upgrade just to deal with the population we have. We've made a down payment on that with the bond this year, but this is going to become more and more severe in our era of climate change and the result of development, which we discuss in the next slide. Our ecosystems in Arlington have been under pressure by this combination of climate change and also local development. At the moment, 45% of our surfaces in Arlington are impervious. We are losing 9 acres of permeable surface lost every year. The development that we're seeing that has been green lighted under existing zoning, not taking into account upzoning, is adding impervious surfaces equivalent to the footprint of the Pentagon every 3 to 4 years. It's leading to mature tree loss and additional runoff. And this is the kind of thing that we don't need to increase and accelerate by an enormous new upzoning program. And also, as we're now in the situation where we're facing COVID, that adds an additional complexity as we discuss in the next slide. COVID-19, as you all know, you're all living with it, we're all living with it, has created enormous budget gaps and uncertainty in ways that have not yet been quantified completely by the county board. They're just beginning to do it. They're just beginning to come to grips with it. But we know that APS is going to need additional resources from the county, regardless of just at its current size, to respond to things like new HVAC systems and other systems that will be necessary when we return to school, but COVID still isn't controlled, to make them safe enough to attend. We're going to have greater need on another great demand on county budget will be for social services and eviction assistance. And we know that tax revenues could be declining further from various sources as a result of pandemic demand. So this really is not the time to engage in a sweeping upzoning residential policy change. And we kind of sum up these ideas of the missing middle in the slide that comes next. The county in its missing middle study, despite the impacts I've just been discussing, and despite the flawed county design where it's set up the missing middle study so that in phase 1, it's only going to study what housing types that might be missing from certain neighborhoods should be added without considering their environmental and fiscal impact. And then once they've built up demand for those, then they're going to go to a phase 2, they say, where they might consider some fiscal and environmental impacts. First of all, we think that's a bad design. They should combine the two, and they should be considering the fiscal and environmental impacts right now alongside with these so-called underrepresented missing middle housing and the impact of those things on schools, transportation, parks, and other services. We here at Arlingtonians for a Sustainable Future don't think this is good planning. We think it's poor planning. So what can we do about it? What are we asking the county board to do, and what do we think you should be doing to ask the county board to do? And we sum that up in our last slide. In order to really assess the impacts of the potential upzoning that county board members and Housing Arlington says there's going to be a lot of, they just don't know where it is yet, we think the following definite studies and computations need to be made. We think the county must begin to perform site-specific fiscal impact analyses for new multi-unit residential projects. We've got one on the agenda for this county board meeting this coming week, in which a Lion Village resident whom we've consulted, John Huntley, is going to be presenting testimony of what a fiscal impact analysis for that Greenbrier project looks like. These are things that the county ought to be doing right now. We think the county ought to be releasing all of its existing internal but unrevealed long-term operating budget forecasts. The county has these. They use it for internal purposes. They should be revealing them now so that we can all see them and we can see what the impact, the sensitivity impact is of changing various assumptions about growth, development, tax rates, et cetera. And we think that before any real forward motion is made on the missing middle study, the county should actually prepare 3 versions of long-term operating forecasts comparing what they would look like under current zoning with what they would look like under upzoning. We think we need a long-term operating budget, and revealing what the county already has internally is a start, but we think they need a longer term than that. We think the county needs to be candid about the long-term environmental impact of all the additional housing that would be created as a result of upzoning and the missing middle initiative. And we'd like to see them as well develop a long-term projection of household income by quintiles, showing the disparity of different household groups compared to national averages. We know you're going to have some additional questions. We'll be here to answer some of them tonight, but you can always also send us questions to our website. And also go take a look at our website, and you'll see that Mr. Huntley, Dr. Huntley, who is a Lion Village resident, has also prepared, and we've put on our website, his countywide analysis of the fiscal impact of missing middle housing, in which he confirms what Housing Arlington apparently most of the time now reluctantly concedes also, that missing middle housing as they envision it in Arlington is not going to be affordable housing and is not going to be helpful. Other experts like Professor Storper, whom we cite, also have come to this conclusion that in hot markets like Arlington, the idea that we're going to get affordable housing out of missing middle housing is simply a fantasy, and is not come close to be worth the costs that we've discussed here. Again, my thanks to you, to the Lion Village Civic Association, and we appreciate this opportunity, and we'd be happy to answer questions at the appropriate time.
Thanks, Peter, for your presentation. At this point, at this time, we'd like to invite Matt DeFerrante, who's a county board member, to comment on this proposal. And once Matt comments on it, then we'll open up a question and answer session. So Matt, we'll give you the floor. Let's see, you need to.
There we go. Can you hear me now, John?
Yes.
Great. Thanks, John. And thank you, Peter, for the chance to be here. Also, thanks to each of you here at the Lion Village Civic Association. I have some slides. I'm going to try to be brief so that we can get to the questions. I see in the chat there's some great points that are being made. I'll start by trying to share my screen and just see if you guys can see this presentation. Are you able to see that now?
Yes.
Okay, so this is fairly recent, between October 28th and today. Probably most of you were trying to see which direction the national elections and everything else was going to turn out. So there have been a few slight changes, but I will try and make this quick, and we'll start off. I'll go down. This is a longer presentation. I'll start with what background on what the missing middle housing study is, and then I'll go into a little bit of background that is available via the research compendia that are related to this study, and then I'll wrap up fairly quickly. So we used an interactive approach with polling, and I'm going to skip right over this because we don't have it in this case, but it was meant to, and it did elicit opinions across diverse viewpoints, some in favor and some opposed to what the perception of what missing middle is. I'll just start with, this is sort of the key question. What is the missing middle housing study? It's a study to address a problem that candidly I and other members of the county board see, that the cost of owning a home in Arlington is getting further and further out of reach. Many of you on this call 20 years ago, your home in Lion Village might have been worth $500,000 less than it's worth today. That's wonderful for you, but it also has challenges for you. Your taxes would go up just because the value of your home would go up. It has enabled us to do some things like invest in our schools, which I would argue, and most would agree, are good things, I believe. This study is about adding choices to how Arlingtonians could afford different types of homes. And those are described as, they could be duplexes, triplexes, they could be the small garden style apartments that are right over in Colonial Village that have been designated historic. They're in Westover, they're across the county. So the missing middle housing study is trying to address some of the challenges of housing affordability, which I would distinguish from affordable housing. Housing affordability is also related to whether you can buy a starter place that you own in Fairlington or in Colonial Village, or eventually a single family home that has space around it. That is, those different types, Missing Middle is seeking to address that challenge. It also touches on a number of the other areas that Peter mentioned in his presentation. The goals, and I want to just be honest, that I don't have an agenda with respect to ending single family zoning. That's just not accurate. That's not something that I think we should do in Arlington. And describing that as the goal would concern me if I owned in Lion Village or any part of Arlington. I've recently bought a home and we're in a single family zoning area. I think that all of us should work together so that housing can be affordable. And I think we have to acknowledge that. So if you look on the side of the screen, it mentions options. I will be honest that I don't think that we can, the no change argument, the stay the same, the status quo, that is not Arlington, and it has never been Arlington. We were the fastest growing county from about 1945 to about 1965 in the United States. When I was growing up, Arlington schools were not as good as Fairfax County schools where I grew up. No change is not realistic. It's how we evolve or how we change that's the real debate. And so what we have asked is look at the problem of the increasing lack of affordability that we're seeing in ownership housing, many cases, and get options, do analysis, help us work through this with all of the civic associations and civic organizations. And that's why I'm here tonight, and that's why we have a robust engagement plan. So options is what we're looking for. I will put in the chat after this the research compendium. And I would submit to you that the data in that research compendium is very hard. Some of it is just very hard to argue with. It points to the challenges that we're facing. It points to the differences in median income for different ethnicities in Arlington. And I think that we have a responsibility to at least consider that. So I'll put the research compendium in the chat when I'm done and when we get to questions. There's a number of study phases. The phrase upzoning, it is a great, scary phrase. I do not know what it means with specificity. It can mean, oh my goodness, we're not going to have any single family housing. But that's not what I'm thinking about, and that's not what I would propose. And that's not what my colleagues or county staff are saying. We're ending single family zoning countywide. If you look at the phase that we're in this slide, we're working through the process. Yes, we think we can't stay the same and be a place where the American dream can work in Arlington for your kids and grandkids without your help. But we haven't fixed on any specific set of policies just yet. We are looking and interested in the analysis and, frankly, in your thoughts. So there's a community engagement process. I will try to be brief. This is a couple of the components of it. There's the public, and there's an engagement process that we are seeking to work as collaboratively and openly as possible in COVID to do. There are also community partners. Anyone is welcome. Certainly, Arlingtonians for Our Sustainable Future would be welcome to be that. I'm mindful that the recommendation might be to not proceed, but that would still be something that I would be open to and we would be open to. There's a technical advisory group as well. So that's a little bit of background. I will send the link to this presentation into the chat as well, but I want to keep going so that we can get to questions. Why would we do, I've touched on this, why would we conduct a missing middle housing study? It's a range of types of housing, not income, it's size, not price. And so you see duplex, triplex, courtyard apartment, bungalow court, townhome, multiplex, garden style apartments is not in this picture, but it also should be in this picture. These are examples of missing middle style style housing, duplexes, row houses in Chicago and in Richmond. This slide is examples of missing middle housing in Arlington. And some of you may recognize some of those places. The sixplex, for example, is right near where I used to live in the Odyssey condominiums, just down the street near Colonial Village, a little bit outside of Lion Village Civic Associations. This is a picture that describes, that shows where it's that edge development between the large buildings and single family homes typically. This moves on to, we have a worsening housing gap. I think last time I was at Lion Village, I told the story of an 84-year-old woman who I knocked on her door. She lives in Lion Village, and I knocked on her door 3 years ago when I was running in the primary and then in the general election. And she pointed to across the street where a huge home had been replaced and said, is there something that you can do about that? And that is part of the concern. You know, we are seeing teardowns, and that is not the outcome that we want in as many cases, because as Peter mentioned, there are homes that are so much more expensive than they were in the last 30 years, over the last 10 years. And so we're seeing a worsening housing gap. This slide shows a little bit of the percentages of missing middle housing types. I would note that garden style condominiums are a key piece of what we're trying to preserve, but they won't stay the same. Colonial Village needs rebuilding so that those units won't dilapidate inside them. So preserving missing middle housing will require renewed investment, even if we keep the same size of locations and housing. This shows a little bit of the gaps that we see in terms of duplexes, townhomes, and low-rise garden apartments. In the interest of time, I'll just keep moving us forward. We're seeing regional growth that is showing increased costs of housing. If you look at single-family construction, this is a map that is meant to show some of the replacements that I was just mentioning of smaller homes with significantly larger homes, which are less affordable. This, I'll move on to other important neighborhood issues. We have all been struck by the need for racial equity and racial justice, and that really is also a factor in our consideration of how we seek to address housing policies and land use policies. For example, this is just a fact. For approximately 30 years, row houses were not allowed in Arlington. And the reason for that is fairly clearly linked to a fear of diversity and inclusion, racial inclusion. That's just, if you look at that, the Arlington Historical Society, be afraid of row houses. Be afraid of these folks who will come. That is not anyone on this call's fault, but we do have a choice about what we do to act going forward. And so that is a consideration, honestly, in my thinking with respect, and I think our thinking with respect on the board, and some of staff's thinking as we work forward to a policy that might help us address some of the diversity that we could have and might want to have in home ownership. This slide is very striking. If you look at our median income and you compare it for Black, Latino, Asian, and white families, we're not close to a society that is colorblind in Arlington. These are Arlington numbers. And I, like many people in Arlington, got help with my first down payment. But some part of our policies should be focused on fairness that doesn't just reward those who can afford their first down payment. So this slide and then the one below it, if you look at a legend of the overlap between single family housing and white neighborhoods, it is very significant. It's not saying we should feel guilty, but it is saying we should consider it as we make policy. So in the interest of time, I'll keep moving forward. This slide addresses what I would say is probably another, in my view, misconception. And it's certainly, I just want to be transparent. I do think we're going to grow in population. That's Arlington's history, and it's inevitable. We can't freeze where we are. But I don't have an agenda that wants to grow fast. It's how we grow that matters for all of us. And so getting to 301,200 is not a personal goal at all of mine. I look at each project and try to fit it into how we can grow and how we can best serve our whole community. An example is the building that just went up closer to Roslyn, which many of you may have seen, which is an APA project that's a Queens Court project. There's a number of additional units, about 100 in that project, but it helps make Roslyn affordable and helps us not concentrate truly affordable housing at below 60% of area median income, just in the south or west side of Columbia Pike. So there's not a goal to accelerate development. It's about how we grow that matters, in my view. This talks about the region. Peter described the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, which is relevant but not driving for me. For me, it's what's best for Arlington. So I'll just keep moving forward. I have just one or two more slides that I'd like to make. We have a lot of different ways of trying to address affordable housing. There's a need for affordable housing that can make sure that county and APS employees can live here. There's also a need to make ownership housing more reachable for all of us. So this slide I just want to touch base on. It talks a little bit about trees. If you look at a map of 1945 Arlington, we had very few trees. That's also a fact. That's because we used to be farmland. So it is concerning that we're losing tree canopy, and that's why we have an incentive to add additional trees in our tree canopy fund. And existing trees have disproportionately good environmental impacts. But we also know that some of the very large new single family homes are driving a lot of the contribution of the loss in impervious cover. So it's a factor that we absolutely need to consider. So stormwater, it's also the case, we did pass, and I was happy to support 50 million in bond funding. I think the causes of our stormwater challenges have a lot to do with our decision in the 60s, 70s, and 80s to underground our streams. And they are also, in my view, and I think data supports this, driven by the expansions in single family homes at least as much as the concerns about affordable units being built in Arlington. So with that, I think I really have hinted that I would try and be as quick as I can. The only other thing that I'd like to just pass along is this site with information. I think I touched on most of the points. I will say one other thing. I didn't support Amazon coming to Arlington because I wanted to supercharge development. I think it's important to note that I said, and we have said, those of us who supported, all of the board members, we supported it because we had a huge tax base in Crystal City, and we lost it because of the base closings and for other reasons. Amazon locating in Crystal City helps us prevent the huge loss in commercial tax base that would have led to us continuing to rely more and more over time on single family homeowners like Lion Village to fund the great services like schools that we have put forward. So that's one other concern that I would say sort of, in my views, Amazon was not about let's supercharge development. It was about let's rebalance at 50%, 50%, which is our historic balance, our commercial and our residential tax base. That's a historic piece. All the rest that I've tried to present to you is missing middle, moving forward. And I'd love to take questions at the right time.
Okay, thanks, Matt. So what I'd like folks to do is you can put a question in the chat box, but I want to see it with a question mark, not just a comment. And then we'll give each of our speakers a chance to answer that question. So, and I'd like to open this to Lion Village residents first. So when you ask your question at the outset, if you can tell us where you live in Lion Village. All right, let's see what we have here. Okay, any questions? I'm just seeing comments at this point. Okay, here's one from Tom, who lives on Highland Street. Says Arlington's small physical area can lead to distorted conclusions. Why not consider missing middle as a regional issue as we do with other common issues? So what we'll do here is we'll let both Matt and Peter respond to this, and we ask you to keep your response to about 2 minutes if you can. So who wants to go first? Okay, Peter.
Sure. Well, the questioner is absolutely right that Arlington is a very land constrained small part of a large regional economy. And one of the concerns that our group has is that because we have so little land available, we can't simply try to solve the problems of other parts of the economy and other regional parts of the Northern Virginia region by taking on the kinds of commitments that they can, because they have a lot more open space. And in many cases, they also have more robustly funded programs to acquire new land. Here in Arlington, we have a county board that has approved a goal of acquiring 3 acres of open space per year, but has refused to fund it. And the result is we have no funded policy to acquire additional land. But prior to upzoning or prior to the missing middle, we're anticipating population growth in excess of 300,000 people living here. And so the conclusion of that is that we are facing much greater density than the county board has demonstrated that it can finance and ameliorate the environmental impacts of it. So I sympathize with the premise of the questioner that Arlington is small and land constrained and can't do more than what we can do with that limited amount of land.
Okay, Matt?
Sure. It's a good question. To some extent, we are considering housing policy regionally, but missing middle ultimately is rooted in land use policies and zoning policies, which are only determined at the jurisdictional level. Arlington has its own land use. It's one of the slides, it's the general land use plan, which was adopted in 1961, and we have amended it multiple times, of course, since then. So land use policy is decided primarily at the local level. We could never have the authority to tell Fairfax what to do with its zoning policies. We are, however, looking at other jurisdictions for best practices. So I think the answer is yes, we're looking at it regionally, but there's some practical legal and legal reasons why we couldn't strictly be coordinating precisely with other areas. The other things that I would say is just that, workforce and affordable housing for teachers and firefighters and police officers is part of what Missing Middle is about. And we want our employees to also live in Arlington. And I know that it's not easy, and I know that it's not affordable, unfortunately, for a single breadwinner who is one of those categories. But two teachers, I do know, live in our number of two teacher families, and firefighter and police officer, those sort of families, households do live in Arlington, and we want them to. Last, I just say that we are not hitting our, we need to hit our 3 acre per year open space areas. We also are not hitting our goal for the number of affordable, truly affordable, less than 60% of area median income units that we set in our housing plan. Our plans are not contracts, they're goals, and they're debates about what's the best set of policies to make us better in the future. And so I think there are a lot of good points made about needing a long-term plan. And I'm JFAC liaison because I believe in your point on that, Peter, but I also don't think we should think of these as contracts. This is about a debate about what's best for our community in terms of policy, in my view.
Okay. Next question comes from Bill Maxwell, who lives on North Herndon Street. It says, given the pre-existing trend away from large office spaces and additional reduction following the COVID crisis, wouldn't it make more sense to convert offices and substandard hotels in the Crystal City area to residences?
I guess,
So who'd like to go first on that?
you want me to go first?
Matt?
Okay, I'll happily
you
do
can.
that. It's a great question. And actually, when I sought to serve on the county board, I thought what you thought. I thought, can't we take office spaces and make them residential? And it turns out that it's cheaper to knock down those buildings and rebuild them as residential than it is to convert an office building in Crystal City from the cinder block that it is into residential. And it's not only cheaper, it's probably better for the environment over the 20-year period, because the energy efficiency rating of new buildings under county policy is way better than the 20 years of an old building. So in cases where we can, I'd love to do that. But what I learned from people is that that's the best that we could do. And I see additional comments, but I'll pause, and Peter, over to you.
The premise of the question is right on target in that the impact of COVID on office space and working from home is likely to be very profound over time. But we don't know right now how profound it's going to be and how much vacant office space we're going to have in Crystal City. or in the RB corridor or other areas of Arlington, we're not going to know the final answer to that for several years. But it could be that there's going to be a lot of vacant office space, and that vacant office space may well therefore lead to a decline in the valuation of that office space and put additional pressure on residential homeowners who are going to have to make it up because we can't tax differentially residential versus commercial. And to me, all of that argues for a careful pause and a cost benefit analysis of whether it might make sense in some cases to actually, as Matt said, demolish the office buildings and build residential in their place. But the final point I would make is related to a comment that Matt made earlier, that the status quo in Arlington has never been an option and really can't be an option now. And in a general sense, I completely agree with that. The population growth forecast that I discussed at the outset, and that Matt mentioned as well, the idea that we expect our population to grow to 301,000 by 2045, that's a pre-upzoning, pre-missing middle calculation. So Arlington, based on existing zoning and existing land use plans, is going to look incredibly different and is going to be very transformed between now and 2045 if no additional missing middle housing is built under the Missing Middle Initiative. So in the end, I think we should recognize how profound the impact on the office building market is, and that indicates we should be very cautious about upzoning or a large-scale missing middle initiative.
Okay, next question I'm going to ask. How do we determine what's the optimal population for Arlington? You know, we can't grow forever. And today, you know, we know that there's many factors that we have to consider when we're considering, you know, buildings and houses and everything else that are going to be built, you know, such as the pressure on schools, parks. Everybody likes to have green space. Traffic's a big issue. Parking is a big issue. Pedestrian safety, the services that the county offers, water runoff, fresh water, coverage ratio, which affects these areas. How do we finally decide, okay, what's the optimal population for Arlington in terms of what we can handle? Because if we keep growing for years and years and years, at some point, we're not going to have a lot of green space, and we're going to have trouble getting water and handling runoff and everything else. So when do we finally figure out what's our optimal population?
So John, let me go first on this one. I think I indicated in the last slide of my presentation the way I think Arlingtonians for Our Sustainable Future recommends that we go about answering all those terrific questions that you just asked. And one of those ways is to start with the pre-upzoning population growth forecast of growing from where we are now of estimated 236,000 to 301,000, which is the best available forecast that Arlington had at the time they made it. And at the time, based on the MCOG data. So, and let's see what Arlington would look like in 2045 with a population of 301,000 with no upzoning, and what it'll look like with whatever kind of upzoning the Missing Middle study ultimately recommends. And let's see what the costs are to our budget and our environment of doing the no option alternative, under which we're still going to grow to 301,000, or what it's going to look like with a large Missing Middle initiative where we might grow to 350,000. And let's quantify it, and let's see what those budgetary and environmental impacts are. And then let's share it with the community, share it with the activists here in Lion Village and everywhere else, Don't rush to judgment, and let's have a dialogue about what Arlington looks like under these different scenarios, and ask the community in the context of that specific information on fiscal and environmental impacts, which community do you prefer?
Okay.
So I do think, I'm not sure that there have been many communities in the world, in the history of the world, that have ever said, we want to be precisely this number of residents. And I do think that I actually agree with Peter's point that and the manager has been moving along, but I would like to see us use a broad cost benefit analysis to assess the costs. It is the case that there, in addition to Professor Fuller, there's also Jeanette Chapman, who currently heads, there are experts who point out the benefits of the benefits that it can accrue of well-planned growth. And I'm not talking about economic growth in the form of Amazon. I think most on this call would probably support in terms of relieving pressure from our budget. Before COVID, we were in for a good budget year, and that, in my view, was not unrelated to the decision to there. But more broadly to your question, John, I think that we need to be thinking about the various costs and issues, and they're related, but they're also benefits to growth. And so we need to be looking at economic growth without disproportionate density can benefit our community. And that's the history of our schools over the last 30 years. We spend more per child by far than Fairfax. We can afford to do that because we have a lot of businesses here that are here. One fact, 75% of the land in this county is controlled by 23% of the people. That's single family homeowners like me who have more land by far than if I have kids or grandkids. They won't be able to afford this without my help. And I want to live in a community, and we all, I think, want to live in a community where you work hard and you get where you're going, but we can continue to absorb additional people with the benefits of those additional people being greater than the cost. When I lived at the Odyssey, I ate out too much, and I definitely subsidized the rest of the county because my tiny condo was not as big as the other pieces to it. So you ask a hard and good question, John. I agree that we need cost benefit analysis. If you think that we can stop with adding housing, we're different than San Francisco, but San Francisco said no more housing. And that city is completely unaffordable. I'm not arguing that missing middle will bring down the cost of housing. I'm arguing that it will slow the rate of increase in the cost of housing so that your grandkids can buy a place to live here.
Okay, thank you. All right, next question here comes from John Armstrong, who lives on North Jackson Street. It says, where do you see adding missing middle housing? Would it be concentrated along the corridors?
Can I try this one first? I'll try and be briefer. But from my vantage point, it makes more sense to have a duplex or a triplex 1 block away from Whitlow's than at the Lion Village Community Center, which is down. It bubbling out seems more appropriate to me. There was also a comment in the chat about impervious cover. I think it's a real concern. So I could envision supporting in targeted areas, though I haven't made up my mind, and I want to reemphasize that. I have not made up my mind. Keeping the building footprint the same in areas that are closer to the corridors, and perhaps allowing, in depending on the circumstances in the zoning district, allowing a duplex instead of a single family in places close to our corridors. That's how I think about it. There are others on the county board who think about it differently. I do think that all of us need to be in this together as to how, and that includes where I now live up in Rock Spring. All of us need to be in it together into thinking how we can do policies that are in all of our interests.
Okay, Peter?
So again, I think the question of whether the development under the Missing Middle Initiative should be concentrated in the corridors is a subpart of where ultimately they're going to propose it. But under the existing zoning and the zoning that was in effect at the time that that forecast was made, that we're going to have over 300,000 people living here in 2045, under our existing land use plan and zoning, there are assumptions built in there that assume that there's going to be substantial increased density along the RB corridor and the Crystal City corridor, certainly, with our current zoning, with no Missing Middle Initiative, no changes in zoning. And so again, because the county has failed to show us what the fiscal and environmental impacts are going to be of growing to 300,000 under existing zoning, we have no basis as a community to compare how that would look compared to additional density on the corridors in this case, or somewhere else, authorized by changing zoning in single family neighborhoods that are zoned single family only now. So there's really no way to evaluate this without producing the kinds of studies that we're advocating for, and having the county board as a unit, as an entity, committing to giving these kinds of data to the community before it even considers going forward to a vote on changes to our current land use plan.
Okay, thank you, Peter. All right, our final question here, because of our time, comes from Jackie Snelling, who lives on North 21st Street. She says, have you considered that with the reduced need for community and increased telework, there may be a reduced demand for housing in Arlington near DC offices and reduced population growth and reduced need for commuting? So how does that factor in?
So I'll start. I think it's a great question, and that's part of why Peter mentioned, and I think it is right. Before COVID, we had committed, the board had committed to doing, if you remember, in Amazon, we went to the discussion leading up to the Amazon vote, we went to almost every civic association. And in January and February, that's what I planned and what our board as a whole planned on doing. But things changed. And so your question, we do need to consider it. I would suggest that, the housing market since COVID has not slowed down. There's still a lot of demand for housing here, and ownership that are in the missing middle housing type area. So we need to consider it, and staff needs to consider it more, and so do each member of the board. But I do think that the demand is still going to be there, and I would, to Peter's example, missing middle housing types are unfortunately not likely to be affordable to what we like to think of as the middle class in the country. But the middle class in Arlington is 124,000. And I think that the two units at slightly reduced costs are better for a community that includes not just the wonderful people like me who live in Rock Spring, or the lucky, frankly, the also lucky people who live in Lion Village, but also the people in apartment buildings and the 20-somethings who are and the 30-somethings who are having their first child or trying to make it, the phrase community must mean more than just those of us, including me, who are single-family homeowners.
Hey, Peter?
So I think what we need to do in response to Jackie's very good question is to produce at least 3 and maybe 4 or 5 scenarios with respect to which will contain alternative assumptions about price and occupancy and rate of growth in the context of the longer term operating plans that we advocated for at the end of my presentation. Let's see what they look like in the reduced demand for housing in Arlington that Jackie asked in her question, have we considered it? If the county board has considered it, they haven't publicized it. And we need to create those alternative operating long-term budget scenarios, share them with the community, and have a dialogue about which ones are more likely than others. And if the answer is it's too early to tell, then we should slow down the missing middle initiative until it's time to tell. With respect to Matt's last point about affordability, I'm pretty sure that I place a higher priority on directly helping the people who really need genuine workforce housing, teachers, firefighters, lower income people of any race or ethnicity, and funding that directly through vouchers, through increased housing grants, through increased rent subsidies, to enable people to live anywhere in Arlington, and not talk as if the horrible zoning conditions that we had in the 1930s going up almost to the end of the last century are still true today, because they're not. Those were horrible conditions that prevented people of lower incomes and certain races and ethnicities from moving to Arlington. The thing that prevents any of this now is income level. And excuse me, but I prioritize, just as a person, putting our money into helping people on the lower end of the income scale. If you're on the higher end of the income scale, I don't really want to rush to enable you to buy a $1.2 million townhouse. I'd rather, if you can't afford it now, that you move farther west and don't come to live in Arlington. We're planning on 300,000 people coming here with no upzoning. So, but basically, I think we need to answer Jackie's question in the context of multiple operating budget scenarios and a robust community discussion of numbers and the fiscal and environmental impacts of each.
Okay, thank you very much for thank you both for a very robust, extensive discussion of this important topic. Appreciate you both sharing with us tonight. So I know we could talk a lot longer about this, but we'll need to wrap it up now, and we're going to move on to discuss some school issues. So this is something that came up in the last couple of days, and it was Curtis Ofari who brought it to my attention. So what I'd like to do is, you all are excused, and we're going to turn off the recorder at this point too. So we will have the missing middle discussion recorded.